Hello, my name's Alex Smith. I'm a senior coach with the ADHD Advocate. And what I want to talk about today is procrastination, because one of the things I work on, particularly with students, one of the biggest things you end up working on a recurrent basis with ADHD is procrastination or struggles with activation in the absence of either urgency or interest. And what's quite interesting about procrastination is that the discussions around procrastination always start with time, or they start with either time or willpower. And what I'm going to argue today is that whilst time management and potentially willpower do play some role in procrastination and the drive and our drivers for procrastination, the root out of procrastination is rarely time management or improvements in willpower, or kind of struggles with willpower. There's always like an emotional element to it and the energy-based element to it, particularly for clients with ADHD. So just introducing the subject a little bit. So what you often find is when people come to coaching, what they want to do is procrastinate less. They want to get more done. They want to be more productive. They don't want to be lurching from crisis to crisis, where the only way in which they do things is when there's a direct negative consequence of not doing those things. They're pulling an all-nighter to do an essay, and a lot of the struggles with, particularly at universities, a lot of things have very long deadlines where the student is left for a long period of time as like judged during execution for what they're doing. There isn't that kind of accountability you get at earlier stages in school, where you will have weekly deadlines or people following up on you if you haven't done things. And these conversations always start with, I need to do something about time. I do need to do something about my willpower. And it makes quite a lot of sense, because in many ways, people with ADHD have a very distinct and very different relationship with time. And I've covered it a little bit on this slide here. So what you tend to find with ADHD is there's a kind of chronic nearsightedness and a time blindness. People don't really, out of sight, out of mind could be used to describe ADHD. People don't really find long-term goals motivating. They can't see the route towards long-term goals, particularly if there isn't a like short-term feedback loop around what they're doing. A lot of people with ADHD have a very non-linear sense of time as well. They struggle to use past actions to predict future outcomes. I mean, this is often from a executive functioning point of view. This is often called self-monitoring or self-reporting. People with ADHD tend to be quite poor at self-reporting, and that often they're not often able to summon what was present and what was absent when things were going either well or badly. Another thing is that people are very hyper-reactive with time. One of the things that's often said about ADHD is that people with ADHD only recognize two sorts of time, which is now and not now. Anything else is basically extraneous to their experience. So what often happens with ADHD is that people have this horrible wait for urgency. My clients often describe it as lurching from crisis to crisis. It's essay, all-nighter to do one essay, then a period of becalmment, then the next essay becomes urgent, and then there's another all-nighter. So it's a very kind of, and often urgency is a useful thing with ADHD. People tend to be kind of hyper-functional when there is urgency, but it's a very exhausting and ultimately a very burning out way of living it. A lot of people, when they operate like that, if they end up burnt out, overwhelmed, exhausted, or they either overpromise and underdeliver, or overpromise and then have to overdeliver. So they leave themselves not enough time to get things done. And things like dissertations, which is probably one of the dirtiest words in ADHD, is basically you can't put an all-nighter on a dissertation. It's absolutely, even with the ADHD hyperfocus, it's very difficult to do 100,000 words or 20,000 words in a single sitting. And again, a lot of this is very logical. That a lot of studies into ADHD have just described ADHD as like people with ADHD as being sprinters, not marathon runners. And there's always that struggle with deferred or delayed gratification. It's easier to do something if there's a short-term reason, positive reason for doing it, or often a short-term negative consequence of not doing it. And in this context, procrastination is always presented as a functional issue. It's very much and often it's, I would say, also a fundamental issue of ADHD. I would say universally, clients that I work with to some extent are bothered by the fact that they procrastinate or are inconsistent at activation. And this often causes a lot of negative labeling that reinforces this as well. You know, one of the throwaway comments that you get with ADHD is, well, you can do it when you're interested, as if that's some kind of character flaw. But that's absolutely ADHD in a nutshell. People with ADHD are able to find functionality when they're interested in something, or when something that is urgent, that is elusive to them the rest of the time. Another one of my clients put this really, really well. He said that I'm great at the things that nobody else can do, but rubbish at the things that everyone else can do. Again, it's the problem with that is, again, people get labeled according to that. You know, people tend to make a judgment based on what they see you doing. So if they see you doing difficult things really, really well, they assume if relatively simpler things in their minds, like, you know, should be, the only reason you're not doing them is because of some struggle with willpower or some character failing. And that's, you know, what you tend to find. It's a very uneven skill set with ADHD. People are very often very good at doing the creative, difficult things. They're less good at doing the kind of mundane bit, the bibliography of the essay, the spell checking. You know, once the creative element has gone, the mind checks out. And then the other thing is that people then get very bothered by this. A lot of the labels that people with ADHD carry is around laziness, or kind of inconsistency, fickleness, things like that, or unreliability. And I've worked with hundreds, probably thousands of clients with ADHD. I can confidently say that I've never met anyone with ADHD who's fundamentally lazy. I mean, contentedly idle people don't have bookshelves groaning with productivity and time management books. And often, you know, when you're coaching someone with ADHD, you can see behind them books, you know, shelves and shelves of books on productivity, time management, focus, etc., etc. Idle people don't bother about being idle. They kind of, they basically, they almost wear it as a badge of honor. So, I mean, there's a famous quote in a similar vein about narcissists. You know, narcissists do not worry about being narcissists. You know, everyone I've worked with ADHD is bothered about procrastination and bothered about struggles with activation. And this leads to something that's quite interesting. One of the leading studies on procrastination was done by, it resulted in something called the Procrastinator's Code. It was done by two researchers called Burke and UN. What they concluded, and this wasn't neurodiverse specific, but what they concluded is that procrastination is not actually fundamentally a functional issue. It's definitely not an issue in which willpower plays the central role. So I mean, if you were to take a one-line summary of their study, it's this one here. What they said is that the emotional roots of procrastination involve inner feelings, fears, hopes, memories, dreams, doubts, and pressures. So basically what they were saying is that ultimately, when you kind of unpacking procrastination in more detail, what you're looking at is not primarily a functional issue, not a time management issue, not a willpower issue. You're looking at something that is actually quite a deep-seated and deep-rooted emotional issue. And then they developed this theory. And what they looked at, you know, they interviewed a lot of people that had struggles with procrastination. They looked at a lot of the kind of research into kind of human motivation. And then what they identified, and this is where you'll probably see quite a lot of resonance from an ADHD perspective, they identified various emotional drivers that often contributed to procrastination. And it's not saying that all these drivers are present in every single person. It means when I look at these drivers, there's 4 or 5 that really, really resonate with me. There's 4 or 5 that really don't resonate with me. And I think, you know, when I've shared these with clients, it's a similar thing. They have certain aha moments. Oh, that's absolutely me. That's why I procrastinate. And others, it's like, well, that doesn't really resonate with me. So it's not saying that all of these drivers will always be present. But looking at these drivers, one of the first ones, and again, one that comes up a lot in ADHD and is often like a kind of quite a common bedfellow with procrastination, is perfectionism. So the first one they looked at is, I must be perfect. People that procrastinate often have very high bars of mastery. They have very, very exacting, unbending expectations of what they need to do and what they need to do to succeed. Another one which relates a little bit to that is that everything I do should go easily. A lot of the time people procrastinate when they perceive what they're doing as hard. You know, some people, it's like, you know, a form of procrastination is they just engage with easier tasks, or they kind of check out, they leave the task that they perceive as hardest, write the dissertation, and then do a lot of tasks around it. They might don't know, like that's the time when they start doing the washing up. They start reordering their notes or kind of highlighting their notes. Very good people with ADHD tend to kind of be very creative at making the things that they want to do feel like the things that they need to do. Another one is around risk. A lot of people, but again, this is particularly if you're nearsighted and you don't have a sense of linear progress. A lot of people with ADHD don't get a reinforcement of progress from doing things. So another reason that people procrastinate is it's safer to do nothing than to risk failing. You know, if you don't try, then you can't have failed because you haven't tried. You know, it becomes kind of a quite circular argument there. Another one is people say I should have no limitations. You know, when people procrastinate, when it exposes the limitations of their knowledge, the limitations of their capability, when they're on the edge of their comfort zone. Another one which links to perfectionism is if it isn't done right, it's not worth doing at all. And again, you know, you see that a lot with ADHD. People often struggle with getting things done. What they do far exceeds the demands of the situation. Some of the biggest disappointments of my life were seeing what other people did to get certain things. I remember when I was at university, I ended up marking a lot of English A-level scripts. And it was, hold on a minute here, you can write 1,500 words on Harry Potter or whatever it might be. I've just slaved away and written 25,000 words on Dostoevsky. I think a lot of people with ADHD, you know, it's actually quite useful to do that, to have a look at what other people have delivered or produced in the same circumstances, so that you've got parameters of scope for what you're doing. One of the reasons people with ADHD procrastinate is because their expectations of what needs to be done actually exceeds what actually needs to be done. Another one that relates to that is I must avoid being challenged. It's like, you know, a lot of people, again, links to rejection sensitive dysphoria. If they showcase themselves, if they showcase their abilities, and then someone criticizes it, or if it's something that they place value in and someone challenges that, then basically that's often very triggering to RSD. So it's, well, if I don't do this, if I don't show my true self, if I don't actually show my opinions here, then my opinions can't be challenged. Another one related to that is if I succeed, someone will get hurt. Another one is this idea of people making a rod for their own back. A lot of people with ADHD, they feel trapped in a cycle. Well, I mean, you often talk about the rat race, and it's the same with like a lot of people with like ADHD students are high achievers, or they have been high achievers, or they've got a track record of high achievement. And again, this creates a pressure in itself. You know, if you're always the best person in the class, every time you move on to university, to a master's, to a PhD, the people you're competing with are probably also the best people in their class. So, you know, the likelihood is always being the best. I mean, you see it in sport a lot. You know, something like the 500th ranked tennis player will never win a tournament during his career. He still was probably the best tennis player in his school, in his county, possibly in his country. So this kind of comes into play as well. It's like, if I do well this time, I must always do well. So sometimes it's not fear of failure that kind of shuts people down, it's fear of success. If I succeed here, if I get straight A's at my A levels, my family will expect me to go to university. I don't really want to go to university. If I do well at university, they'll expect me to get a master's. If I get a master's in law, they'll expect me to be a lawyer. And so it's actually, the pressure is the success of climbing a ladder that you don't believe in, or that you don't feel that you ultimately want to succeed at. So a lot of it, sometimes it's rule driven or authority driven. So people say, well, if I follow other people's rules, or I kind of conform to expectations here, I'm giving in. I'm somehow negating my creativity or my own agency in the process. The next one is, it's a kind of all or nothing thing that you see a lot in ADHD, which kind of links a little bit to FOMO. I mean, the modern kind of explanation, the modern thing is that people with ADHD have a very acute fear of FOMO, or fear of missing out. So if I can't let go of anything or anyone or anything, you know, then I'll procrastinate. So, you know, with an ADHD spin, it's like what people often say with ADHD is that decisions feel like forever decisions. Because of the nearsightedness, the decisions feels like you're making not the decision for now, but forevermore. You know, if I decide that I want to study psychology at university, it means that I'll never be able to study philosophy again. So people with ADHD get stuck in that kind of almost like that nether zone where, you know, it's often where they pay the ADHD tax. By the time they've realised that actually they do want to study psychology rather than philosophy, the psychology course is booked up and the philosophy course is booked up as well. You know, so it's that wait for kind of certainty that it's the right decision. Another one which again links to RSD, you know, is and also boundaries, which are a real challenge with ADHD, is if I show my real self, I'll be disliked or judged negatively. You know, I won't be approved of, or if I assert my own needs and boundaries, approved of. The interesting thing is, I mean, and I see this a lot in my executive coaching, is often people are respected for a certain boundary. Some of the most successful senior executives I've worked with, that's what they're very, very good at. They're not like intellectual superhumans. They're not relentless models of productivity. Often, actually, if you look in boardrooms of companies, they're empty before the rest of the company. What they're very good is gatekeepers of their own time and energy. If they need to go to the gym between 10 and 12, they're not contactable between 10 and 12. And people with ADHD who are people pleasers, often what happens is that their most productive times, they're pleasing other people rather than protecting their own time and energy. The other one is this wait for readiness. It's often said that perfectionism has two faces with ADHD. One is the face of the classic perfectionism, wanting to do things to a very, very high standard. The other thing is waiting to be perfectly ready. So what people often say is, when I have X in place, then I will be able to act. And that's one of the greatest ever deceptions of ADHD. I think I don't really like mantras in coaching, but I think a mantra that holds true pretty much universally with ADHD is action before motivation. If you wait for motivation, you will never do anything with ADHD. You always have to kind of act in order to get the motivation or to ignite interest. So just building on that, what you tend to find is that the key often to overcoming procrastination is understanding the emotional resistance. Our brain doesn't procrastinate to basically self-sabotage. It doesn't procrastinate to make you kind of useless and sit there gaming all day. Our brain is hardwired to protect us and to help us survive. It doesn't, it sabotages because it thinks it's helping us. It doesn't sabotage because it wants to make you fail your degree or whatever it might be. And this is why kind of looking at kind of procrastination from the perspective of energy and emotional resistance is actually quite liberating. What you tend to find is that, the route out of procrastination is rarely kind of willpower alone, or as you see starred in the corner there, it's rarely just having a better time management system or a better organizational system. What you tend to find with procrastination is that one or three broad scenarios are present. And I find this, and I've done hundreds of coaching areas around procrastination, and in virtually all of them, I would say to some extent, one of these three areas are present. First is the situation where the ideas, effort, and knowledge are being handed over for scrutiny. So it's, people tend to kind of write their essay, get it 90% done, then they freeze. And the last 10% becomes like an agonizing process of spell checking, rewriting, reworking it, whipping it up, starting again. What's changed in the last 10% is that consciousness of that handing something over for scrutiny or for the evaluation of others. And that often, particularly with the RSD of ADHD, tends to shut people down. So they get the struggles are either end of the scale, the first 10%, the last 10%. Second one is, again, one which I touched on before. It's that if I commit to something, really commit to this, I'm going to rule out something that is more interesting, more fun. If I dedicate this Tuesday to writing the essay, all my friends go out clubbing. What if that's the best club night of the year? It's that kind of thing that always comes into play. It's that fear of missing out. It's like it's the sense of everything with ADHD. There's a real struggle with relative importance. So everything seems equally important until it isn't. And you've also got a brain hotwired for interest. So if what you're trying to do is actually uninteresting, you're always looking for creative reasons to do something else that's more interesting. It's amazing how things like the washing up or putting up pictures that have been left for 6 months seem really, really appealing when you've got an essay to write or when you've got something like your tax returns to do. And then the third one is very much linked to the nearsightedness of ADHD. If people don't believe or can't see a vision to completing something, which is often a real challenge with ADHD, because that inability to project too far into the future or to really, really visualize long-term goals, then procrastination is almost like a natural response. If the brain doesn't want to dedicate loads of hours, time, effort, and energy to something it doesn't believe it's going to succeed at. So basically, situations where the ultimate goal seems overwhelming or the rewards too distant for commitment, for that commitment to seem worthwhile, tend to be real triggers for procrastination. So what you've got at some level is that people's fear of failure basically exceeds their expectation of any likely success. And then this is the next bit to it, is it what it allows from a coaching perspective when you start looking at some of these nuances, when you start looking at the emotional aspects of a procrastination, the energy aspects, the fear of missing out, the kind of competing priorities. What it gives you, what you're often trying to do from a coaching perspective, is give people more choice, make them aware of things that they haven't considered, strengthen their arsenal of solutions to a particular problem. And what approaching procrastination from this kind of perspective does is allows you to move away from what tends to be the obsession that people have when they come to coaching, which is that basically they'll only be able to stop procrastinating when they have something better in place to manage the procrastination, rather than when they've understood the root causes of the procrastination. So what often, when you often ask people, particularly students, what they're looking for from coaching, what they're actually often looking for is what I would describe as a once I have, then I will strategy, or a number of once I have, then I will strategies. So I've got 3 quite classic ones here that you kind of see that, and the problem with these strategies is that they collude with procrastination. They don't overcome it. If anything, they often intensify it. It's like, well, I will continue to procrastinate until I found this amazing elixir of non-procrastination strategy, the best time management strategy, the best app, the best Pomodoro solution. So these are 3 here. That once I have a better time management system in place, then I'll be ready to start my dissertation. They often actually get presented very much in these terms: if or once I have. Once I have all the knowledge that I need, then I will be ready to make a decision. And that creates a lot of scope creep around the decision, what essay to write, et cetera, et cetera. Once I've revised everything, then I'll be ready to book the exam. If you said to someone with ADHD to book an exam when they're ready to do it, they would never take an exam in their life. So, if you said to someone like, you have as many driving lessons as you need, three days before you feel ready, book your driving test, I would be willing to predict that virtually no one with ADHD would ever book a driving test. So it's being very conscious of this need for readiness, or this sense of wanting readiness. And then finally, this is, as I say, this is something that I explore very, it's very difficult to cover in a very short session, but it's something that is quite relevant to this conversation. So is that is the kind of questions that you can ask yourself, or the kind of questions that I would be asking as a coach, where someone is struggling with procrastination, where you can see behind them a whole raft of time management books, where they've come to label themselves as lazy, or lacking willpower, or feckless, or unreliable. These are the kind of things that I would be looking at. I'll be looking at 2 areas basically. First one is emotions and the emotional impact of procrastination. What's driving it? And again, these vary hugely from individual to individual. What would cause one person to procrastinate, for example, speaking in front of an audience of 1,500 people, might really energize another, but it's the kind of, what causes one person to procrastinate is another person's kind of kryptonite. So it's always very, very varied. But what you're trying to do when you interrogate from these emotional questions is you want, the reason people procrastinate is to protect themselves. At some level, the brain is thinking, well, procrastination is serving me well. It's protecting me from harm. It's protecting me from failure. It's protecting me from being exposed as a fraud or as an imposter. So what you want is that you want to have a sense of the value of not procrastinating, and you need the value of not procrastinating to exceed the protection of procrastinating. So 5 kind of questions that I'd often ask in this area is, where is the emotional resistance to this task? And there'll always be something. So it could be that you failed at a similar task in the past, or that that basically there's a real pressure around it. You have to get 80% in that essay to get a first. So the resistance is it's your last chance saloon. It's like, or it could be that basically that if you do really well at this, then the pressure will be building to do the next essay to the same standard, and you're not sure you're studying the right subject, or something like that. Next one is it's very associative. The ADHD brain is very associative. It tends to kind of connect the dots through like emotions and and sense and intuition. So what labels am I trying to avoid? If for example, where you failed at something in the past, you've always been labeled as lazy, what you might be avoiding is future things where that your struggles with getting started on them will cause people to label you as lazy again. So there's often there's patterns in the procrastination. People procrastinate over the same sort of tasks. Next one is like stick-based strategies don't really work very well for like ADHD generally. So is seeing the outcome. What is the rewards of not procrastinating? You want to have a clear sense of the rewards of not procrastinating, not, so that it's not simply I must do 3 hours on this, I must sit and revise all day. You need to see the future value. What am I going to do with what I'm doing? How am I going to actually use this in my life going forward? How's it aligned to my values or my future aims? Another one is, what am I associating this with? Where am I associated with past failures or past frustrations or past events? And then the final one is that what people often say with ADHD is they get into this very all or nothing, everything or nothing point of view. I mean, one of my clients, the way he describes living with ADHD is, if I can't do everything, I can't do anything. And it's at points like this where kind of compassion are really important. It's well, if you can't do everything, if you're kind of at a low ebb, if what you're trying to do is overwhelming, there's still something you can do in relation to that. And often that something will be an igniter of interest or an igniter of urgency. And it's very, I do a lot of work on habit formation. It's very critical to habit formation. The classic habit thing that people do is they haven't exercised for 6 weeks. So they set themselves a target of going to the gym 7 days a week. Because people with ADHD have a very high bar of mastery, if they don't go to the gym on Monday, then what they say is, well, I can't go to the gym 7 days this week. I'm not going to start this until next Monday. Yet people with ADHD are very reactive. They're quite, just like they drop out of habits easily, they drop into habits easily as well. So in that scenario, going to the gym on Sunday and even just sitting having a coffee at the gym and seeing, body dubbing and seeing other people exercising or working out, probably a much greater predictor that you'll end up going to the gym 7 days a week after. So it's the same with essays. If you can't face doing the whole of the essay, can you write the introduction? Can you go to the library and get all your books together in order to write it? Can you think about what environment's the best essay to write the essay? Can you talk through which question you're going to do with your lecturer or your friends, so there's some extrinsic energy around it? All of those things kind of contribute quite a lot. The second set is a load of questions around energy, which what I just said leads quite nicely into it. People with ADHD are heavily reliant on extrinsic energy to get things done. And so like the action first, motivation second, action preceding motivation is a very, very relevant mantra or thing to remember with ADHD. A lot of my clients kind of get quite concerned by this, because not all people with ADHD are extroverts. There's a difference between extroversion and extrinsic energy. Extraversion, extra basically means outside of oneself. And there's a lot of people I've worked with that are introverts. There's a lot of people that are extroverts in the kind of life and soul of the party term of the word. But basically, I think with both introverts and extroverts with ADHD, they are still heavily reliant on extrinsic energy to get things done. Operating in a vacuum where they're basically, there's no energy around what they're doing is very, very kind of stifling. It shuts people down with ADHD. Lockdown, I think, had a disproportionately negative impact on a number of my clients, and continues to do so, because a lot of the time, even where people do return to the office or return to university, a lot more people are working from home. So there's less access to the ability to collaborate and ideate with other people than there was before. So in the vein of energy, that there's 5 similar, there's lots of other questions I would ask, but these are 5 of the main ones. It's like, if you're stuck, often it means there's not enough energy. There's not enough short-term feedback loops around what you're doing. There's not enough opportunity to ideate with other people. So what I say to people is, where are my collaborative foils? Could be simply that, going for a coffee with a friend to talk about your essay plan will be enough to ignite interest. What's very rarely enough to ignite interest is just sitting there turning the same thing over in your head and ruminating repeatedly. Another one is, particularly things like dissertation is, something like having a weekly meeting with your supervisor, your dissertation supervisor. You need a next handover point with ADHD. It's no good being left with something for months on end. And if there is no kind of natural handover point, how can you create one? Can you arrange a fortnightly meeting with your supervisor? Can you meet with someone else who's also studying at the same time and each talk through your progress in the last week? Another one, particularly around handing things in, is what's the point of diminishing returns? Where has the kind of time, effort, energy I'm putting into this exceeded the real value of it? And there's always, and often people with ADHD hold on to things way beyond the point of diminishing returns. There's only so often you can check something. There's only so often, and the more you do that, the more the novelty drains from it anyway. Sometimes, it's better to kind of cut your losses and like hand something over early. And sometimes it's often a real disappointment for people with ADHD. They realize that basically they spent an extra 10 hours on something and they might have got 72%, where in reality, if they'd handed it in 10 hours previously, they'd have got 71%. The net result is the same. It's like a lot of the time people do far more than is demanded of the situation. Another one is like wants and needs. People with ADHD are very, very creative at kind of conflating what they want from a situation with what they need. They often, particularly with things like essays, they get bogged down with the minutiae. What font should it be in? Is there kind of equal paragraph spacing? Does it look nice on the page? Is it aesthetically pleasing? If you're not being marked for those wants, you don't need to do them. Something that is not needed is basically, it's dead energy, it's dead time. So, and so a lot of the time, it's like what you often help people to clarify is this a want or is this a need? Are you doing it because it's going to actually, get the result you're looking for, or is it out of some form of comfort or need for yourself? And then finally, the one thing that often helps with people is where people are really stuck with ADHD is breaking things down into smaller parts or taking the easiest thing first to ignite energy. So what you often say to people is, you're really stuck here, so we're not going to concentrate on writing 10,000 words. We're not going to concentrate on finishing this essay. But what is the lowest hanging fruit? What's the quickest win to ignite momentum? And then once momentum's often ignited, then it's much easier to continue and stay in action. Hope that's helpful. And I say this covers what basically the main takeaway is that often procrastination really, really shuts people down because they're looking at it only as a functional issue and only as a kind of issue of willpower. When you look at it from the perspective of emotion and energy, often you find kind of solutions for yourself, solutions which aren't linked to character failings and things which are actually much more sustainable going forward.